Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm actually rising under Standing Order Section 48.2 on a question of privilege, and notice of which was given this morning in accordance with the standing orders. I would ask you, Mr. Speaker, after my brief remarks, to make a prima facie finding of a breach of my parliamentary privilege and refer the matter immediately, because of the time-sensitive nature of the breach, to the House of Commons Standing Committee on Procedure and House Affairs. The breach of my parliamentary procedure relates both to my individual rights as a Member of Parliament, to my rights as the Shadow Minister for Foreign Affairs, and as well, Mr. Speaker, I'll highlight why I think also there's collective breach of the rights of all members of this House of Commons, because as I'm sure you know, Mr. Speaker, there are individual rights that each Member of Parliament has, regardless of side of this House, as well as collective rights that all 338 members and yourself, Mr. Speaker, have. These are founded within the Constitution Act of 1867, as well as within the rules of this place and several generations of decisions from the chair. And I'll reference the most recent one that is germane to this request. At the heart of the issue of parliamentary privilege of a Member of Parliament is for the Member of Parliament to be fully able to deliberate, debate, legislate, and most importantly, Mr. Speaker, especially for members of the opposition, to hold the government to account. That is at the heart of our parliamentary democracy, and it has been impeded. Anything that impedes my ability to fill my functions is a breach of my privilege. Specifically, that breach was highlighted yesterday by the Minister of Public Safety, who acknowledged that confidential information related to the Prime Minister's trip to India was shared with members of the press gallery, who don't sit in this place but maybe above it or observe it, Mr. Speaker. And that same information is not being shared with me as a Member of Parliament. Furthermore, our ability to question the National Security Advisor, Mr. Jean, who shared that information with members of the press gallery, is not able to appear before a committee of this place, Mr. Speaker, or a committee for the upper house, further stymieing our ability to fulfill our requirements and obligations as Member of Parliament to hold the government to account, Mr. Speaker. I will highlight this specifically because yesterday, when the Minister of Public Safety, to many journalists, including one of the journalists that was briefed by the National Security Advisor, he suggested that the National Security Advisor could share information that he deemed to be confidential with reporters, but the Minister of Public Safety was not willing to share that same information to members of this House of Commons. And that in itself, Mr. Speaker, is a prima facie breach of my privilege as a Member of Parliament. As I've said, these rights have been adjudicated on by various chairs since the founding of our Confederation. It inhibits, as an individual, my ability to have freedom of speech and information to inform and color my deliberations and debates in this House, Mr. Speaker. As well, there's also a critical individual freedom members of Parliament have, and that is the freedom from obstruction or interference in the fulfillment of my duties. Not only as a Member of Parliament who has a background in defence, security, and these affairs, Mr. Speaker, I have additional duties to hold the Minister of Foreign Affairs to account with respect to Canada's role in the world and our diplomatic function. In the last week, Mr. Speaker, this chamber's been seized with the largest diplomatic incident Canada has witnessed in a generation. And the Minister of Public Safety yesterday acknowledged that information relating to the government, and in particular the Prime Minister's specific allegations or claims that a partner, the Indian government, is somehow involved in this crisis, the Atwal affair, it's now named, Mr. Speaker, the diplomatic crisis of a convicted attempted assassin who tried to kill an Indian parliamentarian on Canadian soil, was invited to formal prime ministerial events. That is an external affairs, a foreign affairs crisis, Mr. Speaker. The minister yesterday confirmed that information with respect to the Prime Minister's defense in this House of those claims, information was shared with members of the press gallery who they would know would publish it in their newspapers or online or on television, thereby waiving any confidentiality claims. That same information they're withholding from me as a parliamentarian who is charged with holding them to account, Mr. Speaker. It is astounding and far worse than the judgment from former Speaker Milliken, who I'm going to refer to shortly. Not only does it breach my individual privileges as a member of Parliament in several ways, it is a breach of our collective rights. I'm sure even members of the Liberal caucus who were not on this Indian junket trip, Mr. Speaker, are offended by what happened. And they, as government members, have a right collectively to institute inquiries, call witnesses, and demand information to this chamber. So not only are my individual privileges as a member of Parliament being stymied by the Liberal government, by admission, by the Minister of Public Safety, who yesterday said the same information they did share with journalists they're not prepared to share here, that in itself is a prima facie indication that they're violating my privilege. There's also a collective violation inherent in this withholding of information, Mr. Speaker. As I suggested today in question period, often the cover-up can be worse than the crime. Now, I don't think there's a crime here. I'm using that as an expression. But there was a diplomatic incident that has caused Canadians great concern, great international embarrassment, and today, members of the Conservative caucus raised how it's already impacting our pulse farmers, Mr. Speaker. And we're not able, as members of Parliament, to actually have the same degree of information that the Prime Minister's office offered to journalists to try and defend or explain away a crisis with respect to the Atwal affair, Mr. Speaker. I refer you to the seminal case from the Supreme Court of Canada in New Brunswick Broadcasting versus Nova Scotia, where parliamentary privilege must be, I quote, absolute, unquote, and necessary, Mr. Speaker. All of our legislatures and our federal parliament must respect the absolute privilege of its members to be informed, to have debate, deliberations, and to hold the government to account. That is the core of our parliamentary democracy, Mr. Speaker. And suggesting, as I said, the Minister for Public Safety, by suggesting the National Security Advisor was more than capable, or more than, he had the ability to share this information with journalists but not share it with the House. That in itself suggests the information he shared was not confidential. If they're going to, as damage control, Mr. Speaker, share information, clearly it is not information that CSIS was saying, stop, you're jeopardizing our national security. That's why this side of the House feels that the Prime Minister's office engaged the National Security Advisor in a media smokescreen attempt to deflect attention from the Atwal. I'm not sure that's the case, Mr. Speaker, because I'm being stopped from performing my duties as a member of Parliament because the Minister of Public Safety, the Prime Minister, and the Prime Minister's office, because we all know it's there, Mr. Speaker, are not sharing the same information they shared with journalists to suggest that they were not to blame for the Atwal affair. I have no ability to see that information. And I'll quote Speaker Milliken on April 28, 2010 in the Afghan document decision, Mr. Speaker, on a similar type issue where confidentiality, national security were part of the debate. I quote, "It is the view of the chair that accepting an unconditional authority of the executive to censor the information provided to Parliament would, in fact, jeopardize the very separation of powers that is purported to lie at the heart of our parliamentary system and the independence of its constituent parts." End quote, Mr. Speaker. This chamber, the men and women that stand in this chamber, sit in this chamber, participate in the debates of our nation, are the most important constituent part of our parliamentary system, Mr. Speaker. The chair before you, probably one of the most profound writing speakers, Speaker Milliken, said that specifically when the executive, the Prime Minister's office, suggested confidentiality would prevent parliamentarians from exercising their absolute privileges. This is all four corners of that Speaker's decision apply to this case. And in fact, the Minister of Public Safety, as I raised in question period today, highlighted that breach of privilege yesterday to the media when he confirmed the National Security Advisor, we believe, at the request of the Prime Minister's office, shared information with journalists that they're now preventing us from having over claims of confidentiality, Mr. Speaker. Here's an interesting sidebar, and everyone knows, especially the Deputy House Leader, that I love to look back into the history of things. When the Milliken decision in 2010 came out, the then Liberal leader, Michael Ignatieff, was quite happy with this decision, Mr. Speaker. And Speaker Milliken recommended a compromise because there actually was confidential information here, Mr. Speaker. The waiving of confidentiality by allowing the National Security Advisor to brief the media shows that that's a red herring in this case. But in the Afghan documents case, it was a real concern. So the Speaker's decision recommended a compromise so that the parties could get together and make sure the privilege of MPs was not impeded. Who did Michael Ignatieff charge to work on behalf of the Liberal Party to make sure that privilege was maintained? The House Leader at the time for the Liberal Party. Who was that, Mr. Speaker? The Minister of Public Safety. Sometimes when you hear a long, long time, you've seen everything. So that minister has seen everything. He's seen this. He knows that by not providing us the very same information they've provided journalists, his work on the Milliken decision and the compromise from it shows that the production of documents, the provision of information, and even witnesses to allow a proper deliberation, debate, and holding of government to account is a breach of privilege. That decision dealt with not just production of documents and information to allow for that deliberation, that debate, that holding to account. It also, Mr. Speaker, dealt with the issue of tampering or impeding witnesses from being part of the parliamentary inquiry. So I would refer the chair to the Milliken decision with respect to that as well. That's interesting in this case as well, Mr. Speaker, because the National Security Advisor is a senior civil servant. He was charged to brief the media, thereby suggesting that there was no confidential information they're now claiming can't be shared with us, and Mr. Jean cannot appear before the Public Safety Committee or Committee of the Senate. I suggest any confidentiality or sensitivity of that information was waived. But even if it wasn't, what did Speaker Milliken suggest in the case with a letter from an Associate Deputy Minister with respect to the Afghan documents? He suggested that letter, Mr. Speaker, provided a chilling effect on the civil service, and the ability for Parliament to fulfill its obligation, Mr. Speaker. This is a far worse chilling effect because the National Security Advisor for Canada has never made public statements, particularly quiet, hastily arranged media briefings. This is unprecedented. Even a more senior person than an Associate Deputy Minister, Mr. Speaker. So the chill effect that the Milliken decision was concerned about with respect to impeding, with respect to tampering with the ability for documents and deliberations to take place in this case, also apply here, Mr. Speaker. And unfortunately, unless we get some answers, I feel that the Prime Minister's office has sullied the reputation of a fine 3-decade-long civil servant. Shameful. He should come before committee and confirm, was he acting rogue here, Mr. Speaker? Without the information, I'm not sure, but my hunch is that's not the case. But either way, we don't have the information and my privilege is briefed. I'll end with this, Mr. Speaker. Perhaps I wanted to speak a little bit more before we broke for two weeks, but this is very serious. The only limitations on the privileges of a member of Parliament must be self-imposed. We regulate our debates. My very capable House Leader, on behalf of our parliamentary caucus, works with the Government House Leader and other colleagues to make sure the debate functions, to make sure that we hold one another to account, and the Chair helps us in that exercise, capably informed by the table officers, Mr. Speaker. We determine what information we see, not the Minister of Public Safety. The very fact that he was involved in the Milliken decision compromise tells me he knows that, Mr. Speaker. As well, unelected officials in the Prime Minister's office who determine what civil servants go out and who they brief and what information they share, if they're now trying to impede me from doing my job by not sharing that same information, they must be held to account, Mr. Speaker, because they're not members of this place. We regulate our own debate and our own respect for the privileges of this place. Further, that privilege, and the Milliken decision confirmed this once again, Mr. Speaker, that privilege is not affected by statutes that might prohibit distribution of information. So if there are real confidentialities or national security concerns, which I've said already in my remarks, Mr. Speaker, I don't think that's the case here. That's what the minister is claiming. Disclosure sunshine will show all that. But even if there is sensitive information or confidential documents, that does not impact my privilege to see it. The Milliken decision confirms that accommodations must be made. The Public Safety Committee could meet in camera, Mr. Speaker. The parliamentary House leaders could get together like they did with the Milliken decision, like the Public Safety Minister did in 2010, to make sure that Parliament is supreme, Mr. Speaker. We're not impacted by claims of confidentiality, especially what I'm suggesting, Mr. Speaker, false claims. So, Mr. Speaker, this is a very serious affair. The National Security Advisor of Canada is now implicated, one of Canada's most important allies in Asia-Pacific going forward, one that all sides of this House have taken strong work to try and improve and enhance relationships, enhance trade. Under the Conservatives, two-way trade doubled, Mr. Speaker. That country has now said the Prime Minister's claims are baseless. I can't confirm they're baseless because I'm being impeded in my function, Mr. Speaker. Canada's allies are affected, our reputation are affected, my role as a parliamentarian is affected, all of my collective colleagues in here, their ability to perform their function is affected. This is serious, Mr. Speaker. And given the nature of this affair, I would ask the Chair, relying heavily on the Milliken decision, which is totally on point, when the House returns, you make a decision so that all of us on all sides of this chamber can fulfill our roles as parliamentarians. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.